Ni hao, and welcome back. This screencast is entitled The Big Boys and deals with two of the most important and largest and longest lasting empires in the history of the world, Han China and towards the end Rome, which will be the subject of other videos in the future. But first, the Qin Emperor or the Qin Dynasty from 221 to 206 BCE. When last we discussed China, we discussed the Warring States period and the rise of new ideas and new philosophies and new schools of thought in China. From this tumultuous, chaotic Warring States period emerges the Qin Empire. From the western region of China here, they spread outward and conquer and reunify the eastern regions of China as well. They are based on and draw their logic from legalism. It is not a coincidence that the Qin region is the home of the legalist philosophers and thinkers, and they impose legalism on the people they conquer. This is, of course, a harsh government. Brutal laws to keep the people in line, lots of torture and execution, very brutal. That is why, after the death of the Qin emperor, the Qin dynasty collapses very shortly thereafter. His son tries to rule, cannot maintain control. The people hate him. One crucial error in judgment was the punishment for losing a battle or war was death. So as there is an uprising against the rule of the Qin emperor, he sends his generals out to war. They die or they lose, but instead of coming back to be killed by their emperor, they switch sides. And this weakens the rule and eventually leads to the collapse of the Qin dynasty. However, it does lay the foundation for the next empire, the much longer lasting Han Dynasty or Han Empire. Starting with the Qin and continuing through the Han, China will be ruled continuously by one emperor and one dynasty after another. The Han take over from the Qin and rule for over 400 years from 206 BCE to 220 CE. They build on the example of the Qin by increasing and rebuilding the defensive fortifications in the north, also known as the Great Wall, shown here on the map. They use conscripted labor or forced labor or prison labor, in part to build the wall, but also to build roads and canals and other infrastructure and other massive public works. They also stress the importance of agriculture, wheat and millet in the north and rice in the south. Again, much like the Qin and based on legalism principles. They also emphasize the importance of the dynastic cycle and the mandate of heaven. The idea that they come to power because they have the mandate of heaven. They are going to rule well and wisely until ultimately they lose the mandate and a new dynasty rises to take their place. This will lead to largely uninterrupted rule of one dynasty after another in China until 1911 CE, or just over 100 years ago, the last emperor finally falls. But this pattern of the mandate of heaven and one dynasty ruling over another will last for over 2,000 years in China. You can see here on the map the large expanse ruled and controlled by the Han Empire at their peak, linked and connected through trade routes that we know as the Silk Road with the Mauryan Empire in India here. They also begin to develop and implement an examination system to staff and to run the bureaucracy or their government. There are 130,000 government officials in China. Again, there are over 20 million people, so somebody has to run the government, to collect the taxes, to make and enforce the laws. And it helps if these people are literate and have an education and schooling, as you can see in the picture. So, under the Han, they open schools and academies on a vast scale to train these bureaucrats or government officials, usually through the learning and memorization of the Confucian classics. This examination system will continue in one form or another for the next 2,000 years. They also lead to widespread innovations in medicine, the creation of new inventions such as the magnetic compass, and the development of paper as we know it. China is at this point the largest, the most well run, and the most intellectually advanced culture and civilization in the world, a position it will maintain until the 1800s. We also can talk about the importance of the governing philosophy of the Han. It is often seen as being a Confucian rejection of the Qin legalism, but the truth, as you would imagine, is not that simple. Yes, they emphasized official Confucian doctrine. They taught Confucius in their schools. The Qin had burned many of the teachings and books of Confucius. They reject that and they spread the teachings of Confucius, specifically his ideas of the importance to honor tradition, to respect one's history, and of the emperor's responsibility as a father to his people and to the heavens. As I alluded to earlier, though, they do also maintain conscript labor, the building of the Great Wall, the importance of agriculture. So it is much more a hybrid of emphasizing the teachings of Confucius that are useful to them, to honor tradition and the emperor because that helps to keep them in power, but also using harsh laws and punishments as well. An example of this that we will read and talk about is a primary source on the salt and iron debate. The early Han emperors actually had what we would now characterize as Taoist principles. They were very little involved in everyday life and tried to do as little as possible. Later, they start to impose monopolies on both iron and salt as being important and valuable trade goods. This brings in money for the army, but in the debates, they say this is not really Confucian teaching and is not really Confucianist in principle. But as we have seen, the reality of imposing some rules and some monopoly and taxation is important for protection, even if it's not strictly Confucianist in theory. We can contrast the rule and the government of Han with Rome. Han and Rome both ruled at the same time, and they would both not just conquer and rule over people, but try and incorporate them into the empire. These would not be diverse, multicultural empires like the Persians. Instead, you would join the empire as a full citizen, or they would kill you. They brooked no revolution, no rebellion, no counterculture. They are also important because 1 out of every 2 people in Eurasia were under either the control of Han or Rome. About 60 million people under each empire at their peak. These are the largest, most populous empires in the history of the world to this point. They also emphasize the importance of the military, both to keep the people in line and to protect the people at their borders. The Han army has over 1 million people and the Roman army over 250,000. To compare and contrast, both the Han and Rome emphasize the importance of a shared language. They taught, they educated, and they promulgated laws in one unified language. That would be Mandarin for the Han and Latin for the Romans. They both emphasized a shared culture or values. Under the Han, they taught and spread Confucian values to all of their people. Under the Roman rule, they emphasized the laws and rights all people shared as citizens of the Roman Empire. The Han emphasized rituals, specifically ancestor worship and other long-lasting customs and traditions of China. Rome emphasized their shared culture of language, of the gods, of worship, and so on. There were some important differences. Han placed a greater emphasis on civil officials and bureaucrats educated through the examination system. Rome did not have the schools and the schooling that China did, and therefore they placed a greater emphasis on the army and on military governors to rule the empire. The Han tended to emphasize the past, on continuity, on the idea of the mandate of heaven and the dynastic cycle and ancestor worship, and they intentionally modeled their rule on earlier dynasties that had existed, the Zhou especially, and other ones as well. Rome instead emphasized the adoption of new ideas. They experimented. They borrowed ideas from the Greeks and the Etruscans and other people whom they conquered. We will talk more about Rome going forward. Adios.